Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming tonight. There's a lot going on apparently, and let's just hope that the unfortunate isolation requirements of close contacts has precluded a lot of people from coming tonight because, as we all know, that it's creeping back into Melbourne. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome our co-sponsors for this evening, Hayley Southwick, the President of UIA Victoria, Dr. Bren Carlil, the Director of Public Affairs for the Zionist Federation of Australia. Thank you both for being here tonight and for co-sponsoring our function. So it's been a little over 2 years since AIJAC has hosted a community function with a physical guest. It's a little bit different for me, not staring down the barrel of a camera and coming to you on a laptop or a screen for webinars, but it's great to have physical people in a function. So thank you so much for coming tonight. In what has been a remarkable 2 years for all of us living under relatively harsh conditions in Melbourne, Israel has been going through what can only be described as the greatest positive disruption witnessed regionally in the Middle East, with the ushering in of the Abraham Accords, the normalisation and recognition by major regional Arab players, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco and Sudan. This new regional dynamic, underpinned by mutual interests and friendship, was illustrated just hours ago with the foreign ministers of these new Arab partners, along with the Foreign Minister of Egypt, sitting in Sder Boker near the resting place of Israel's founding Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. Unthinkable, only years ago, I myself witnessed the flourishing ties between these nations. I was in Dubai only a week or so ago, and I was mesmerized at the sight of seeing religious Israeli Jews walking the streets of Dubai in complete comfort and safety. I also witnessed the elation and excitement of Israelis cheering in applause on the El Al flight that touched down in Dubai, a first for most Israelis that were on the flight. While Israel is being recognized as a beacon and custodian of regional stability and carries herself on the global stage as a formidable middle power, the orchestrated delegitimization and demonization campaign carried out by many NGOs, funded by many Western nations, gathers steam in certain sections of civil society. We in Australia are not immune to such efforts, illustrated by the momentum of the Sydney Festival BDS campaign and amplified by toxic one-sided and libelous reports published by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Therefore, the timing of Olga's visit couldn't be more important. We collectively have a responsibility to fight against the delegitimization of Israel, to ensure that the truth prevails, and we are lucky to have Olga with us tonight, not only to discuss the depths of the coordination of these campaigns, the anti-Semitic motivation that underpins these campaigns, but she will also offer some hope with ideas as to how these campaigns can be defeated. So it's now my pleasure to invite to the podium Hayley Southwick to introduce Olga.
Hi everybody. As was said, my name is Hayley Southwick and I'm the President of UIA Victoria, and I have the pleasure of introducing our wonderful speaker this evening. I would like to thank AIJAC for allowing UIA to co-host this event together with the ZFA. The partnership between our organisations is appreciated and valued. In a few minutes, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Olga Deutsch, but it would be remiss of me not to spend a few moments highlighting the vital work that the UIA is doing in the Ukraine. Over the past month, we have witnessed the worst humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. The war in Ukraine is decimating the 200,000-strong Ukrainian Jewish community. The entire country is in chaos. It has been gut-wrenching to watch this unfold. Millions of Ukrainians have become refugees, and Israel has already welcomed over 4,000 Olim. It is expected that up to 100,000 Olim will arrive over the coming months. This scale of Aliyah has not been seen since the early 1990s. UIA's strategic partner, the Jewish Agency for Israel, is on the front lines with workers risking their lives to save the Jews of Ukraine, crossing the border each day to help get Jews out. We are proud to help rescue as many Jews from the Ukraine as we can, thanks to your support. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Olga is no stranger to the UIA. She was a keynote speaker at our AGM last November, albeit virtually. So it is so wonderful to have you in person here in Melbourne tonight. Olga graduated from the University of Belgrade and University of Munich with degrees in banking, insurance and finance. She was awarded a fellowship with the Ford Motor Company, graduating as a community leader at the School of International and Public Affairs of Columbia University in New York. Before making Aliyah in 2009, she served as the chairperson of the European Union of Jewish Students, an umbrella organisation for 34 national unions. In 2008, she received the International Leadership Prize from the American Jewish Committee. Over the past 20 years, Olga has held senior positions in the private sector in Europe and Israel. Olga is fluent in Serbian, English, Hebrew and German. She's married and has 2 sons and is here to talk to us in her capacity as Vice President at NGO Monitor. Please join me in welcoming Olga Deutsch.
Thank you very much. It is really a pleasure to be the first speaker at your first face-to-face event. The past 2 years have not been easy for anyone, but I think here in Australia it was probably even more challenging than in other places in the world, because it was so, well, Joel used a good word, you were so obedient. Maybe in other places we were not, so you had to also, it came with a price. So I'm particularly excited. This is also my first visit to Australia. I've never been, so besides being completely jet-lagged, I landed late last night, I'm also extremely excited to meet the community, talk to people, and see the country. I want to thank you for hosting me, first and foremost to AIJAC and my dear, dear friend Joel. We were fellow Jewish student leaders, and I cannot be more proud and grateful that we were privileged enough to continue with both our friendship, but also in serving the community and the Jewish people and the State of Israel in our adulthood. We're not going to reveal our true age. Thank you, Haley and UJA, for hosting me, and I'm very happy to be in Melbourne. It is really an honor, not only virtually, but now in person. You both opened with, Joel opened with Abraham Accords and this incredible, inspiring times in which we live. And Haley spoke about the unbelievable efforts that the State of Israel and the Jewish people together jointly are making in helping Jews and non-Jews alike in Ukraine in these horrible times. And I'm being asked to actually talk about another topic, but they will all interlink somehow, and that is anti-Semitism and delegitimization of, well, I was asked to talk about the delegitimization of the State of Israel, but I think it's actually delegitimization and anti-Semitism towards Jews, period. So late Rabbi Sachs used to talk about anti-Semitism at length, and he said that anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews and rejection of the right of the Jewish people to have the same right as everyone else around the world. He compared it continuously with a virus, and he would say that just like a virus, anti-Semitism mutates and evolves. He said in the medieval times it was about religion, and Jews were prosecuted for their religion. And in the 19th and the 20th century, they were prosecuted for their race. And in modern times, we are prosecuted for our nation state. And just like a virus, as it develops, it normalizes its presence, right? Just like COVID. We now live with the weirdest realities in the world. So he would say that in the medieval times, the answer that the anti-Semites had was the religion, right? They would attack ours by saying that theirs is superior and that we are trying to violate it. And in the 19th and the 20th century, they tried to answer with what they claimed was modern science, the science of race. And then late Rabbi Sachs would say, and in our times, the normalization of anti-Semitism is human rights. So every time you hear that Israel does not have a right to exist as a Jewish state, or that we as people don't have a right for self-determination because we are violating human rights, or because, and then they give some sort of a human rights related answer, he would say, more often than not, you're looking into the eyes of an anti-Semite. And that's how I want to frame my talk. I want to talk about the contemporary challenges we face in defining anti-Semitism today, as well as finding remedies and answers how to deal with it and how to cope with it, both inside of our communities and outside. And it was always difficult to define anti-Semitism, and it is as difficult today. What is maybe interesting is that we face and see anti-Semitic manifestations today, both in what we call the classic medieval terms. So you will see posters of long hooked nose Jews, and tropes of us dominating the world and being so well connected. And but we also see those same classic tropes being mantled on contemporary Israel-focused or Zionism-focused contexts. So if we in the past spoke about the blood libel, right, where the Jews would drink the blood of Christian kids before Passover, bake matzahs, right, with the blood of Christian kids, today we talk about the water libel, because they will say that the Israelis deprived Palestinians of their access to water and that we deliberately shut down their wells. We would talk about the virus, the COVID libel or COVID apartheid, right? That we brought the virus deliberately to the Palestinian people, or that we deprived them of vaccines, so you have a vaccine libel. And with Ukraine, we also saw immediately that so many tried to somehow patch Israel onto the discourse between Russia and Ukraine. You had all these organizations in the side of the human rights discourse trying to say that the Jews who are making aliyah, like immigrating from Ukraine to Israel, in the numbers that you mentioned, right? At first, a few weeks ago, the Jewish Agency was foreseeing at least 25,000 immigrants, and now we're already talking about 100,000, and the number keeps coming up. But let us add to that the Russian new immigrants. In the last couple of weeks alone, we had 10,000 new immigrants just coming from Russia, right? So the other side immediately tried to portray it as the ultimate proof of colonization of the Palestinian land, that we were deliberately bringing only Jews and helping only Jews to colonize what is originally Palestinian land. There are many ways in which the anti-Semitic discourse progresses today, and there are many avenues. And again, it's all cushioned nicely into the human rights discourse using really nice words. Earlier this night, you mentioned, Brett, the Amnesty's report, and Joel mentioned Amnesty and HRW, Human Rights Watch, you know, the main leaders of human rights today, and organizations that come with such incredible public trust and in dictating what is right and what is wrong today. And just before the war with Ukraine broke, the Amnesty International released its report calling Israel an apartheid. It was an over 100 pages report, going in length in trying to make a quasi-legal case against Israel. And if you think about it for a second, and you pause, they're blaming us for what is probably the worst crime you can perpetuate in 2022, being a racist. Calling Jews being a racist. They quoted B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights, so-called human rights organization, in the report that was the first one to use the term Jewish supremacy. They basically argued that Israel is as an enterprise is an endeavor to systematically impose Jewish supremacy over another race. It is almost mind-boggling, and we are not even 100 years after the Holocaust. But the Holocaust won't do it. It just won't. On my way here on the plane, I listened to a podcast with Dana Horn, the US author who just a few months ago had her bestseller published. People love dead Jews, but they like live Jews less. And she said that we continue to try and fight anti-Semitism through Holocaust education, because that's what we are used to doing in the aftermath of the Holocaust. We think that if we teach them of the horrors that we went through as peoples and how traumatic it is that fourth and fifth, going into fifth generation after, it still shapes us, who we are, and it shapes our identity in such a profound manner that this will somehow help them hate us less. But the discourse around us has changed completely. They are happy to commemorate the dead Jews and the memory of Holocaust. But combating contemporary anti-Semitism is more challenging. And this is where how we defined it comes in. Now, at the forefront of the human rights are the NGOs. And that's what we at NGO Monitor do, okay? The non-governmental organizations who call themselves as human rights and humanitarian groups, self-proclaimed, because there's no definition what constitutes and how do you create an organization. Basically, anyone can do that. And that's exactly what happened on the Palestinian side. Interestingly, after the Oslo Accords, the European governments said, we want to be a vested partner in creating a thriving civil society on the Palestinian side, right? And part of that society is NGOs, that they're supposed to be sort of the conscience, if you will, of the government, holding them accountable, issuing reports, saying when the governments are not doing what they are supposed to be doing. But that is not what happened. What happened on the Palestinian side is that you had all these political activists, some members of Fatah, like the current leader of a Palestinian Christian group, Miftah, 13 groups with ties to PFLP. We call it a PFLP, which is, I guess you know, there's EU, US, Canada, and Israel designated terror organization. There are 13 NGOs. It's a PFLP NGO network, that's how we call it. All of them are both human rights defenders, political leaders, and are linked to a terror organization. And then in Gaza, you have a group of NGOs that have ties to Hamas. So you have all of them promoting human rights. And if you think about it, it's probably the worst betrayal of the Palestinian people and of what we all would hope would one day be peace between two people who believe in democracy. Because instead of promoting human rights, instead of fighting for better access to health or to protecting children's rights, right, or against domestic violence or advocating for women's rights, they hide behind the yes occupation, no occupation discourse. All they can talk about is how Israel is bad, because that allows them to not talk about their real issues. So let me give you a few examples only, because I know today I spoke way too long at an earlier event, and I have Joel looking at me. So I'll give you a few examples of how it looks in practice and how it influences the human rights discourse. And human rights discourse is the discourse. There's no other discourse today, because that's what dictates what we read in the news, and that's what affects policies of our elected officials. It finds its way in legislation and afterwards in the implementing of those laws. In August 2019, there was a terror attack near Jerusalem. Rina Schnurb, who was 17, and her father and brother went for a stroll, and there was an explosive that detonated and killed her on spot. Brother and father were wounded, but they survived. A few months later, in December 2019, Israeli media reported that they arrested a 50-people PFLP terror group cell that is allegedly responsible for that. At least 5 of these 50 were executive senior employees of a handful of Palestinian human rights and humanitarian organizations. They have an organization that is called Union of Agricultural Work Committees. So it sounds amazing. They help Palestinian farmers harvest the land, help them have agricultural infrastructure. One of them is called Union of Women Committees. So they're supposed to work on women's rights. They have a health organization. So on itself, it sounds really great. But all of them had held senior positions in committing a terror attack that left a girl dead. At first, no one believed it. They said, it can't be true. Because we keep saying on our end, we keep saying all the time that, it's political, they keep criticizing. But what changed here, that there was a terror attack, and it was fatal. And maybe not willingly, but because the public campaign was so aggressive and so intense, the European governments, who are the biggest donors, and if we pause for a second, I'll just give you a figure so you understand how big and how vested the European governments through their official development and cooperation programs are. We estimate that every year, at least $120 million is provided to a handful of Palestinian NGOs that are active somehow in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's an incredible amount of money. To the PFLP groups, since 2011 to 2019, European governments provided 200 million euros that we know of, because not everything is transparent and not everything is, not all the information is out there. EU alone provided 38 million to 3 organizations. These are incredible amounts. Now, they do that believing that they're doing good things and that they're helping the Palestinian people develop a democracy. So whether it was because of the campaign, or whether it was because they're so vested, or it was the combination of these things, there was a very vocal campaign in Europe, and we saw one by one governments open official investigations into, and this was mind-blowing, into potential diversion of public funds to terror through NGOs. Just to say that out loud was insane. In November last year, 2021, the Israeli government made another step that made a dramatic shift in this discourse. They actually designated 6 Palestinian human rights groups as terror fronts. Now, they did not accuse them of transferring money directly to PFLP or funding the terror attacks. They actually accused them of something that is more difficult to prove, but explains the phenomenon. It's so much softer. They said that they serve as fronts to, on one hand, recruit activists, in other words, give them jobs and keep them engaged, because all these jobs mean traveling around, speaking in parliaments, mingling with diplomats, doing interesting projects. So they keep them engaged. So when the time comes, they have a full-blown network that is already immersed in the political discourse. But the funding part is not even the gravest. The gravest is the platform and the access that, by working with European and other governments, they have to decision makers, and the legitimacy that comes with. To have your report printed with the emblem of the Australian government on it, or EU, or the UN, right? That is something that actually has no price. So in the last couple of months alone, we saw the EU freeze its funding to all PFLP-connected groups they were funding. The Dutch government investigated. They hired an independent company, consulting company, and after more than a year, their report concluded by saying that this one organization, because the Dutch government only funded one, Union of Agricultural Work Committees, there were ample publicly available evidence that prove that they are linked to PFLP, and that therefore they will cancel immediately the contract with them. The German foreign minister, during her visit in Israel and a meeting with our foreign minister, Mr. Lapid, said that Germany plans to continue funding democracy and human rights and building sustainable democracy in the Palestinian Authority, but will continue to do that without engaging with the 6 designated groups. So there are different ways in which European governments actually proclaim a dramatic shift in policy. Now, most of the same groups that are connected to PFLP and that are involved in the terror attack are the same NGOs who push for the apartheid libel against Israel at the UN and ICC. It all comes together. In last year alone, there were 2 separate committees created at the United Nations with the sole purpose of investigating whether Israel is an apartheid. The Committee on Inquiries that is supposed to deliberate in June, sometime in June, and produce a report, and the Commission on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which also was commissioned in doing another report. This year alone, we expect 5 different UN reports dealing with whether Israel is an apartheid. Half of them, at least, if not all, will be directly used as proof that will be submitted and used by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, should the prosecutor choose to continue, or when he chooses to continue to investigate Israel. It's the same groups that also promote anti-Semitism. You will have a Palestinian group that PMRS, the Palestinian Medical Relief Services, they're called, in their 2015 annual brochure, they ran a series of caricatures depicting old school medieval anti-Semitic tropes, just in a political modern context. They had the Prime Minister Netanyahu stamping Palestinian babies on their way to the oven. They had a Palestinian woman wrapped around her head in a traditional robe, but her robe on top of her head was a Palestinian flag, and she had a bleeding tattoo on her arm that said 1948. They would use images like Palestinian people piled up, like dead people in striped uniforms, evoking, again, the Holocaust memories. Oxfam UK, one of the biggest church-based humanitarian and aid organizations, only last summer was selling Mein Kampf for £7. And when we sent an official protest and a letter, they said, oh, it was a technical mistake by a junior employee. What kind of, how junior does one has to be to just oversee that Mein Kampf should not be sold on Oxfam's website? And there are numerous examples like that. But the question is, what do we do about it? So we know who the promoters are. We know what kind of language they use, and it's repetitive, right? Whether we say Zionism or we say a Jew, it almost seems like the word Jew was replaced by the word Israeli Jew, a settler, a Zionist. And we already understand that there is an ongoing process of normalization of but it's not criticizing Israel. That's another thing. We call it criticizing Israel, but no, it's denying Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. What do we do about it? And I want to talk about some of the policy solutions that were already implemented in the last couple of years that have worked really well in Europe, and particularly in the Australian context, talk about what are some of the lessons that might be learned from the old continent. So we spoke about the policy measures on the terror front. Okay, and it's a much more straightforward case when there's an actual terror attack involved and you can prove a direct linkage. But one thing is for sure is that when the state of Israel interferes in these issues, it is a major statement, meaning the fact that they designated 6 Palestinian NGOs and that the Israeli defense establishment said, yes, they pose a threat, resonated in Europe in a different way than any one of us in the pro-Israel world can ever argue for, no matter what kind of information we put forth. So having our Israeli leaders pick up this issue and educating them as well is extremely important, because when our members of the Knesset go and they meet their counterparts, they should be talking about these issues as well. And they should be talking on your behalf as well, because when they harm or try to delegitimize Israel, they're not only they're actually threatening me in Petah Tikva less than they are you, because an anti-Semite is hardly going to come and attack my synagogue in Petah Tikva, but he might come and attack yours on the same pretext. And that's where another tool comes into the picture, which is, I'm sure most of you have heard of, the AIJAC, Working Definition on Anti-Semitism. It's probably the best existing attempt to define anti-Semitism in practical terms. It's legally not binding, which makes it less controversial amongst our critiques as well. And it divides equally, sort of, practical examples of what are the examples of anti-Semitic attacks, and it talks about more classical ones and the ones that have to do with Israel, although it's not attacking Israel itself, blaming all the Jewish community in Melbourne for the decisions that the government of Israel has done. That is considered anti-Semitic. Judging Israel, singling it out, or judging it on double standards that would not be applied to another state. Obviously denying Israel its right to exist, and so on and so on. So far, 37 countries have adopted officially the AIJAC working definition. It's overwhelming, it really is. It's a reality. But what does that really mean? In 2009, there was an attempt arson on a local Jewish community in a small German city. Three people tried to set it on fire, and they were arrested. They all turned out to be of Palestinian origin. And after a lengthy trial, the judge decided that the crime was not a hate crime. It was a crime. They broke the law, but it was not a hate crime. It would not have happened in Germany today. Not because Germans are more or less anti-Semitic. It's because, just like we struggle with defining contemporary anti-Semitism, think how much of a struggle it is for non-Jews to define it. So by finding ways to, on one hand, adopt the AIJAC working definition, and then pushing for its implementation, we help our community, but we also help our neighbors, our fellow non-Jewish citizens, fight the fight together with us. Because if that judge would have had the training of the AIJAC working definition, he or she would have had better tools at hand to decide that, yes, it was a hate crime. Because when 3 Palestinian boys set a synagogue on fire and saying that it's an expression of their political frustration over what is going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they are basically attacking local Jews that have nothing to do with Israel, and they don't vote in Israel, for something that in Israeli policies, and that constitutes anti-Semitism. So Europe has come a long way, not nearly enough, but it has come a long way. And in the last couple of years, after most governments and the European Union have adopted the AIJAC working definition, are now in the stage of implementing it, basically translating it from the parliamentary declarative level to practical policy areas across the board. So it is important that parliaments adopt it, because that's the first necessary step. But we need to then take it to our police officers and to our judicial system and to our schools in teaching what constitutes anti-Semitism. When we teach discrimination and we teach hate, what constitutes hate today, and when a teacher uses the word anti-Semitism, the teacher should also have better tools at figuring out what that really means, so that he or she can teach the kids what it is. Or if there is an incident on a campus, how is the dean supposed to know whether it was an anti-Semitic incident on campus or not? Before we call everyone an anti-Semite, we might at least try and provide the right tools to fight it. So for example, in January 2021, the European Union, the European Commission, which is the executive arm of the European Union, released a handbook on practical implementation of the IRA working definition. It had a full-blown chapter on educational institutions, a full-blown chapter on judicial system, police, and it had a whole chapter on NGOs, going back to our human rights. They said that the IRA working definition can be used both to basically reward the NGOs who use it as a tool to fight and mitigate anti-Semitic attacks and anti-Semitism as a phenomenon in our societies, but also to sanction those that promote anti-Semitism, basically meaning, according to the IRA working definition, if you promote anti-Semitism as a group, we are not going to fund you, we're not going to work with you, we're not going to give you public space in our municipalities or in our regional councils and so on, we're not going to hold events with you, we're not going to give you the platform. And it's revolutionary. Switzerland, for example, in 2017 passed the first law of its kind dealing only with NGOs. The law was seemingly simple. Swiss money will not go to NGOs that promote hate, anti-Semitism, and/or have ties to terror. Did it mean anything? Because the question is, who defines what's hate and what's anti-Semitism, and who monitors and collects the data of the organizations that Swiss government is funding worldwide, right? And then if the data was to be collected, which committee, which body decides that someone perpetuated any of these things, and what is the sanction? So last year, Switzerland the parliament adopted the IRA working definition, and it was connected, they referenced in the legislation to the IRA working definition. So now we're one step closer. We're still not there, right? Because we still don't know how to actually implement it, but we are one step closer. France did a similar thing. But it's interesting, and this is why I would like to mention it, because they didn't come up with a big statement that they adopted the IRA working definition, but there were no statements how and where exactly they're going to implement it. But for example, and this is a suggestion to what local Jewish organizations and communities can do, in a parliamentary question to the Prime Minister Macron's office, whether IRA working definition will also be applied on NGOs, the Prime Minister's office responded yes, which now means it's a policy. Once you have it black on white, so there are different ways in which we can connect that. The fight against anti-Semitism in all its forms, and the fact that we have a nation state and trying to delegitimize it is the gravest, but it's not the only anti-Semitic threat we have, is probably the most important fight we will have. And it's important not only for our own communities, it's important for our countries. I always like to say that the level of anti-Semitism in any one society is probably the best barometer of the overall health or state of the art of the society in terms of democracy and human rights and tolerance and respect for each other. And every time in history that we saw a sharp rise in anti-Semitism, it was pretty shortly followed by more hate and more division and sometimes conflicts and wars and so on. So by fighting and addressing and educating on anti-Semitism, we're not only defending our own communities, we're defending our democracies, we're defending the values that we as Jewish community, we as Jews hold so dear to ourselves. Joel asked me to speak a little bit also about a different topic, which I want to dedicate a few minutes to, and then we'll open for questions. We can go back and forth, whatever you feel. But I want to talk about we cannot avoid talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how Israel somehow miraculously yet again finds itself in the midst of it. The tiny country that is somehow again hitting the headlines, although it has geographically nothing to do with the conflict. But I also want to say that for me, particularly, the invasion of Ukraine hits a very personal chord. I am originally from Serbia, former Yugoslavia. So, if today people talk about the conflict, the first war on European soil after the Second World War, that's not accurate, because I was there when there was one before in the early 90s. And seeing the images and listening to the narrative, and I mean, I was probably, sadly, a witness of the other side. Like, I would probably be the parallel of what a Jew in Russia would feel today, and that is living in complete blindness, and that's why we should not forget about them. They don't have the same access to media and to information. They are fed a narrative that is completely different to ours. And they don't live in a free country. They don't get to say, they don't get to speak up their mind, and we must not forget them. But there was a lot of talk internationally, and obviously in the Jewish communities, why Israel is not condemning Russia more vocally. And it's a very complex question. But there was a poll done recently, 10 days ago, and according to this poll, there was a report on it in Washington Post. Over 60% of Israelis actually feel that Israel is maneuvering the situation wisely, and I'm deliberately not using the word correctly, but wisely, because this is the situation in which we find ourselves. On one hand, we have a border with Russia in Syria. Russia completely controls the Syrian territory, and Syria is the way through which Iran invests in its Hezbollah proxy in Lebanon, which as of today has 130,000 missiles ready to be shot if necessary at Israel. And we saw during the May conflict that the missiles were not only coming from Gaza. There were not many, but it is a threat. All the operations that Israel does vis-à-vis Iran and so on are closely coordinated with Russia. So we have to navigate that discourse extremely carefully, because at the end of the day, it is a security matter. And this poll, over 60% of Israeli citizens believing that the particular situation is being maneuvered wisely, is parallel with the vast majority of Israelis 100% siding with the Ukrainian people. And we see that Israel was the first one to build an actual field hospital in Ukraine only last week. So far, the only one. We had 3 flights each with 100 tons of aid. We have hundreds of Israeli diplomats in Poland and on other borders with Ukraine, providing aid. We have hundreds of charities, paragovernmental or whatever we call it, national institutions, so the Jewish Agency, but also smaller NGOs. We have individual people in Israel, hundreds of them, getting mobilized. Like the amount of messages I got, can you donate anything from money to clothes? And people were trying to get organized and get people out of Ukraine and provide aid. And we already got a lot of refugees in Israel, and people are providing for them, taking them in. The support for the Ukrainian people is overwhelming, and it's not conflicting somehow with how we view that the government is dealing with the situation. Let us also not forget the incredibly high number of Russian people we have living in Israel, which too are a constituency. You know, our society is very diverse, and that is part of, I'm sure, a political consideration also inside of Israel in terms of how you maneuver and navigate the discussion on the issue. At the end of the day, Israel is guided by being the light to the nations. This is, if there is one sentence that is being constantly repeated in very public, this is an Israeli thing, debates, is that how do we serve as an example? How do we protect ourselves? And yes, it's also part of the conversation in Israel that if the invasion of Ukraine actually taught us something, that is that when a time of need comes, it's every man or woman on his own. Because while the Europeans and the US are supporting Ukraine 100%, there are no troops being deployed. And Germany just increased, for the first time after the Second World War, its defense budget. Pause for a second and think about that. This is Germany in post-Second World War Europe. This was an untouchable, like it was unimaginable until a month ago. Like the Germany in the same sentence with defense budget buying weapons. It is, but they just increased their defense budget, and we will be seeing this from more and more countries. Interestingly, what I'm hearing from the defense private industry in Israel, because we are a leader on that too, right, that they're hiring extensively because they are anticipating that there will be a serious demand for defense technology and solutions. So there is a shift in paradigm in the world. It's a tectonic geopolitical movement. And it's not easy for Israel to necessarily navigate through these murky waters. The fact that we are also being placed in a position, potentially a position of brokering some sort of talks, is an interesting opportunity that sets us at the forefront, but it can also be a tricky one, because if it fails, we might be blamed for it. One thing is for sure, I do not represent the government or speak on behalf of the Israeli government, but the message we are getting in Israel is that whatever it is that we are doing, it is coordinated with Washington and with the other European governments. So it's not Israel acting on its own. And the Israeli leadership so far has managed to balance the two sometimes conflicting messages, right? Because you would have the foreign minister Lapid say one thing that would probably sound a little bit more critical of Russia, but then you would have the Prime Minister Bennett counter it with a phone call with Putin or a slightly less supportive statement of Ukraine. But if you look at it in a concerted way, it's a coordinated message coming from our government. That is not to say that it's a perfect one. It's not to say that we're doing an awesome job, but it is just to say that the reality is very complicated. But the one thing that gives hope is that this is all, including on the anti-Semitism fight front, is that this comes in such incredible times of the Abraham Accords. And while there are tectonic geopolitical movements taking our civilization downwards with war on European soil and the largest refugee crisis and unbelievable humanitarian disaster and a devastated country, and two people that will hate each other for centuries now. And that will not go away. That will, even when Ukraine will be rebuilt, Ukrainians and Russians will hate each other for centuries. But at the same time, we see a new spark of hope in what until a few years ago was, Middle East, the source of conflict, with the Negev summit, with leaders from Israel and Arab states, something that was unimaginable just until a year ago, talking about common threats and joint ways of addressing them. And I think I'd like to finish on a hopeful, positive note that every evil comes with an antidote of something good. And unless we believe that is the reality in which we live, then we might as well just give up and not fight at all. And I hope that we will continue to thrive in Israel, and that you will continue to thrive here in Australia as a Jewish community, because we need each other. We need you, and you need us. We're the same people, and we can only fight common challenges together. Thank you very much. I hope I was not too long. And I would like to open for any questions.
So we have a roving mic. So just hands up, whoever would like to ask a question, we'll kick us off.
Hey Olga, first thanks for coming down to chat to us. One of the themes that's come out of Russia invading Ukraine is, well, if the world can apply such harsh sanctions on Russia, why can't it do the same to Israel? And unsurprisingly, that's created a lot of hope for Palestinians. You know, maybe one day the world can do the same to Israel. Now, Javier Rettigo just wrote an article about, well, you know, along the lines of, it's not in the West's interest to apply those sanctions to Israel, not about the moralistic argument, but it doesn't benefit them in any way, therefore they won't do it. But if history shows us one thing, it's that, you know, societies, take Nazi Germany as the most recent one, you know, anti-Semitism isn't logical, and, you know, if they hate Jews, they're not going to say, well, it's not in our interest, so we won't do that. So how do we know that in the future the West isn't going to turn against Israel because, you know, it's not in its interest?
We could write a PhD on that one. It's an interesting question, and it's a fear. The apartheid libel and the attempt to make a legal case that Israel is committing a crime, right, is part of that ongoing campaign that it's been going on for over 20 years now. And immediately the parallel was lingering in the air, right? The Russian occupation, the Israeli occupation. If you think about it, both sides, the Putin and the Ukrainians, were somehow, again, bringing up Holocaust all the time. It's unbelievable. Like, why? Like, Putin was denazifying Ukraine. The Ukrainians jumped on the opportunity to somehow put Babi Yar in the bombing in the middle of the discussion, not only in Israel. Like, if it only hit the news in Israel, I would understand, because that's something that resonates with us, right? But it was not only the case in the Israeli context. Ukrainian President Zelensky made a less successful attempt to talk about Holocaust during his address to the Knesset, which was actually aimed at the Israeli public and not at the members of the Knesset. But though the public said, the majority said, yes, it was not a very successful comparison, but still, let's not lose sight of what is the actual issue here. What ended up happening is that everyone was talking just about that in Israel. That completely dominated the discourse. There's no way, to your question, there's no way of knowing that they will not come with those claims and that they will not try to draw the parallels, which is why we have to continue fighting on each of these fronts and debunking the claims. I have to hope that it will not, because I don't know what serious person can compare what is happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with what is happening in Ukraine now. But then, you know, you can never predict what those seeking to delegitimize us will come up with, and it's a tough fight because we don't play by the same rules. They throw emotional. In German we say Schlagworts. I don't know how to. Daniel knows it's like one-liner songs. You know, catchy chorus, you know, slogans that they sound very emotional, right? Occupation, liberating our people, indigenous people, our rights to the land, my grandfathers, and they don't have to prove any of it. And then because we play by the rules of democracy, each of our organizations, we go into days and weeks and sometimes months of building legal arguments and debunking and proving them wrong. And by the time we are done, they moved on to the next emotional line, right? And today's news cycle is also completely dominated by emotions. You even saw it in the Ukrainian context. At least the most of things that we got were reporters interviewing people. What did you buy in the supermarket? How did it feel? Did you talk to your dad that was left behind? Now, yes, it's a humanitarian crisis, and we want to see that too, because it's that human suffering that we can relate to, and only in that way can we sort of grasp the gravity of the catastrophe, but we also should be able to get a serious geopolitical analysis of what is going on the ground. And we were getting very little of that because the news cycle is dominated by emotions and by experience. It's all individual experience, how I feel and how I make you feel, and it's not based on facts. So again, back to your question, it's a legitimate question. I'm not sure what the right answer is, other than we have to keep fighting and we have to keep providing the facts and finding the smart ways. It's not the right ways. We don't want to prove that we are right. We want to be smart about it. We have to ask ourselves, how do we influence our policymakers? How do we inform them? How do we help them? We give them tools. I don't want to first blame them. That's the easy part, that they did something wrong or that they promoted anti-Semitism or were apologetic, right? I want to come to them and say, did you know about this and that? Did you know that our taxpayers' money go to ABC? Now, here's a suggestion of what we can do about it. That's how I see the situation. And I can tell you that in our small microcosm at NGO Monitor, and we deal only with a niche issue, we only look at the NGOs, right? There are issues that are much larger. But in the last 10 years alone, our research helped cut over $60 million in funding to anti-Israel NGOs. Some with terror ties, some with promoting anti-Semitism, some promoting BDS, some active at the UN and so on. But that's not even the biggest impact that we have had. The biggest impact we have had is that our research helped more than 15 governments introduce NGO funding policy changes. Because we don't want to stop the civil discourse. We want a thriving, vibrant civil society. But we also want governments that draw clear red lines of what is okay and what is not okay. And that's where we come into the picture by helping them provide tools. And if we are passive, then the lethargy and the combination of ignorance, not deliberate, but ignorance, and other issues and the busy agenda will win the discourse.
What about the role of the educational institutions and the academics in feeding into this whole paradigm? And what's happening there, and where can you intervene, and suggestions you've got in order to actually circumvent that side of things, given the fact that they're influencing a whole new generation of supposedly intelligent people?
Yeah, that's a much tougher question than the first one. I am more hopeful, and I know this is going to sound horrible, but I'm more hopeful at our ability to work with decision makers on policies than I am about our ability to help our young generation. The pace, Joel and I were Jewish student leaders, and only earlier today we were talking about how different the way in which we were active was to how they are active today. And our activism is probably closer to the way you were active on campuses when you were a student than to how they voice their opinions and channel their frustrations or ask for a change today. I think social media has changed everything, in many ways for good, but in many ways it has shortened the attention span and our collective ability to have a serious conversation on anything. A conversation that is longer than 130 characters or whatever it is. I hate Twitter. And if it's not a 30 seconds Instagram reel, then no one's watching it, right? And that doesn't allow a conversation. That also leaves our generation with less access to diverse sources. It's not about us telling them what to think or what the truth is, but it's about the ability to teach them to use diversified sources and to challenge whatever anyone tells them by counter sources or different narratives or different perspectives, right? And I think between that and the actual physical threat that they feel, especially in North America, right? But in Europe, increasingly as well, at visibly showing that they're Jewish, or God forbid, in North America that they side with Israel on campuses, and then coupled with they just want to have fun, right? It is very challenging. I wish I knew what the right model is. I tend to believe that the only way we can help that process, and I'm going to go back to Rabbi Sachs, is from within. It's finding ways to reinvigorate how we teach Jewish identity in 21st century. It's what does that mean to us today? It's different than what it was in the 20th century. The Jewish paradigm has changed. It used to be Holocaust, the state of Israel, and rebuilding Jewish communities in Europe, especially, and the dichotomy between Europe and Israel, North America and Israel. It was clear, and everyone each community knew what their job in that equation is, and now it's all mixed up. And diaspora needs Israel in a way that Israel is, I don't think, ready to rise up to the challenge, because the internal discourse in Israel has not reached that critical level. And we are losing our young generation because we don't necessarily know, just like with anti-Semitism, we don't know how to define what it is that we're teaching, and then we obviously cannot teach it. And I think that's what Rabbi Sachs said. He said, you have to strengthen the Jewish identity from within. And that's the only way that you can empower the young generation. And if they are empowered and they feel strongly connected to their roots, they will feel that is something that they will also want to protect if it's attacked. But if they're not attached to the Jewish roots, if they don't feel strongly about their Jewish future, then they will also feel less prone to go on a fight for it. How we do that? I think there are people who are much wiser and much more experienced on that than me. It's really that's just my personal 5 cents on the topic.
Hi, my name's Henry Greener. I'm a producer of a TV show in Melbourne. It goes internationally on YouTube. And I just wanted to ask you a question about the media. I believe we are losing the media war, the Jewish people and Israel, very much so. And there was a declaration by the Israeli government that we're going to fight this on the media front. And I have made 725 Jewish TV shows to give the Jewish people a positive image. That's what we do. That's the reason why we do it, or that I do it. I've been doing it all on my own, basically, raising all my own funding and everything. I've approached the Israeli embassy in Canberra, have had no replies even, and even the organisations in Australia, I've done it all through private means to keep it going. And I think that the real issue that we have is that we are not getting enough traction through the media because our own media in Australia, the mainstream TV, journalism and everything, is really in a way anti-Semitic. If you look at all the ways that we've seen the image that we've been given and the voice we've been given, and I believe that we have not got a voice as such, and that's why I've kept doing the TV show for 18 years and I get no support. How come as one person in the Southern Hemisphere who does a TV show doesn't get any kind of support, really, literally, except what I have to, scratch and beg. I have to literally get down on my knees to get people to help me. And I've only got one person working with me, never had a volunteer or anything. So I just wanted to know what your slant, because the talk, the basis of your talk is basically what can we do about it? Mm-hmm. And this is what I'm asking.
Well, first of all, kudos to you for doing it and for not giving up. It's amazing that you could build such an initiative and that you are managing to raise money, no matter how little it is.
I don't get anything out of it, by the way.
I am sure of that. I am sure of that. It goes back to what I spoke earlier, is that the message on the other side is a uniform message. It's orchestrated. We only hear one thing. There's no nuances and there's no internal fighting. Like, it's always, boycott Israel. Israel is the oppressor. Israel is this. They all, talking about NGOs, all of them, in each of their reports, they quote each other as sources. And most of the events at the UN, you'll have the same 10 Palestinian and, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty people doing panels together and siding together. And they raise funds from the governments, through the official programs, and they will be partnering organizations, one with another, in getting the funds. So they reinforce each other, and the message is one message, because they're trying to take down something, and they're targeting one specific, very specifically defined target. That's not what we are doing. Each of us has his or her own view, and then we all belong to at least one organization, at least. Each of us is a leader, because we have earned that right to live in democracies. Like, we fought for that. That's our core Jewish value: freedom of speech, freedom of thought, vibrant communities. But that dilutes the message, because, one organization will have a slightly more conservative message and statement. The other one will balance it up with this. The other one has to also please this part of their constituency, so they have to, they will talk about Holocaust or fighting anti-Semitism, but they'll say, just with the Jerusalem Declaration, which is the antidote to the IRA working definition, they say that while Holocaust was unique for the Jewish people, fighting anti-Semitism has to be put in the universal context of fighting racism and discrimination by and large. But if you listen to what it actually does, it's actually relativizing our unique experience historically, right? So dependent on each constituency that we belong to, the organizations on our end, they all have their own message. We're not fighting the fight with one uniform message. And then it's very difficult to fight the fight. And it very often feels like we are all shooting, in different directions, while they are laser precise. It's always the same wound that on our end, with each hit, gets more vulnerable, right? Because they're hitting the same spot over and over again. In politics, they say it's much easier to be opposition. All you have to do is criticize, and promise that you'll do better. But once you get elected, it's much more difficult to stay in power, because you have to prove that you've done something, and that you should be given the trust. And it's the same here. All they have to do is continue saying how oppressive and how horrible we are, and how we are violating systematically every human right on this universe, right? And do it in an emotional way. It's not an answer to your question. It's an explanation of a phenomenon. Should we do anything different? I don't know. Can we be that uniform? Can we all come under one umbrella? I'm not sure. Should we? But here's one thought for you. We should be more corporate about how we do it. And even the media today, I see it in my daily work. If 5 or 10 years ago, in order to get into a conference or into an article on a topic, you would actually have to nurture a relationship with the journalist or with the politician or whoever is organizing the conference, and then pitch them with your content and be relevant and so on. Most of the content today is purchased content, paid for. The media outlets do not make their money by selling papers. No one buys papers anymore. They organize conferences, and most of the speakers are sponsors. That's what it is. And most of the content, it will say it's an ad, but most of the content we get are ads. So we might want to use all the brains that we garnered in our startup nation and in our business side of the Jewish communities, and the same brains that we apply to in our businesses, we ought to apply in how we navigate the pro-Israel or discourse or how we fight anti-Semitism. We need to be more professional about it, sexier, have an actual conversation. PR-wise, how do you frame the discourse? We have to, while the attacks get more emotional, but don't forget, again, they're the opposition, right? We are seemingly the position. Our response has to be less emotional. We're not trying to prove that they are wrong and that we are being hurt. We want to be smart. What's our goal? What are we trying to achieve? That's what we are trying to do at NGO Monitor. Address the phenomenon in a professional way, the way that any company would advocate for their issues. And most of the companies today have advocates in parliaments. Why should we use different tools than they do? It's asking yourself, who is the constituency that they are serving, and what are the issues that they find relevant? Not what are the issues that I find relevant, because he needs to get reelected, not me. I'm not sure I gave you an answer.
Can I just make a supplementary comment, just 1 second, is that look around the room and see the interest of our community in the wonderful, I really think your talk has been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
You've really covered a lot of ground and you've said all really good things, but the actual community who are not here is an indication of our disunity in a sense. I mean, we're united in some way, but we've got such a diverse community. That's the part that I find difficult, that other communities are very kind of much more diverse than we are.
But there's another dimension to that. Social media, I think, plays a much more active role than any other form of media. And it's a peddler of misinformation more than anything else. So even to get out this gathering tonight, social media would have played a much more active role in reaching out rather than the traditional means of actually generating interest. And also, when you look at it that way, maybe we are doing things the wrong way because people are fed misinformation, they're ignorant, they don't research the facts behind anything, but they're gullible. So why aren't we using the same type of tactics that they use in order to beat them at their own game?
Because we can't lie. It's that simple. It really is. They get to say...
It's a tragedy in itself when you look at it that way.
Well,
that's how authoritarian countries have managed to succeed,
and they all...
by victimising one group.
But you know what my comfort is? That all those totalitarian regimes ended up falling. If you resort to unfair, non-democratic means and you use non-legit tools to fight your fight, in the end it will come back backfiring at you, because that's not a sustainable model. And I come from a non-sustainable model in Serbia. The Serbian people are paying the price until today for the lack of democracy and lack of due diligence and processes. And it's always the people that pay the price, not the ones sitting in the leadership positions. We can't take any Gaza conflict, right? You will have or any terror attack. We have had a few in the last couple of days, unfortunately, and it's always the same story. The international media will say Israeli forces armed down 2 Palestinian boys in a conflict or in a shooting. That's not what happened. They randomly fired at civilians, or he took out a knife and brutally murdered 4 people in a mall in Beersheba and was gunned down by civilians that were trying to protect, but by the time that headline made a round of the world, us debunking it is not relevant anymore. How often, and I know you've all seen these things, that, there's an image of a kid in Gaza and, being held dead by his father, and then all of a sudden, it's from Aleppo, from 3 years ago. But by the time that they, again, everyone saw it, it's already a campaign. I don't think we will ever win that fight, and it's okay. Because we don't want to lie. We don't want to fabricate I don't want to live in a country that fabricates news. I don't want to live in a country that explodes facts or distorts the truth or, even doesn't tell the whole truth, but, takes a paragraph, because that's what they do. They will take a paragraph and then they'll only take one sentence and omit the context completely. But then if anyone reads only that one sentence, it reads completely different than when read in a context. I don't want to live in a country like that. So the fight might take longer, and it might seem futile and exhausting and like we're losing. But at the end of the day, and again, I say this coming from a non-democratic country. My youth and adulthood was one big fight for democracy in Serbia. Israel is a vibrant democracy. We fight, we disagree. The discourse is sometimes very ugly and disrespectful. We are not proud of our elected officials too often, the way they communicate and the way they speak. Sometimes they're clumsy, when the Israeli government designated 6 Palestinian organizations, they did such a poor job in bilaterally, multilaterally communicating that. It shouldn't have been a surprise to any of the governments around the world. They should have communicated this with Washington and with all the European capitals where the funding was relevant, right? And they only did that in aftermath. But we are still a vibrant democracy, and I don't know many other countries where each of us gets to yell from the bottom of our kishke, what hurts us, and the other one will disagree and he will yell back, but we both get to say what we have to say. And I think that takes us forward. That in the big picture, in the long term, it takes us forward.
Before we go to the gentleman at the back.
Yeah, look, my comment is probably not totally relevant, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Interesting articles come up on Israeli news recently, coming up with the comments that in their investigations, the Palestinians weren't there when the Israelis came back after 48. Palestine is an invention. And this has been coming from the Israeli news sources lately.
I'm not sure I understood.
What they're saying is the Palestinian conflict with Israel and everything else, it's all make-up. Because when Israelis came to Israel after the war, there was no such thing as a Palestinian group or a state. It's all been made up. And there's been interesting articles coming through from the Israeli news.
Are you suggesting that that's a mainstream news outlet that's promoting such narratives?
I don't read backyard newspapers. There was an article that came through. I get a lot of emails from Israel. And I thought, wow, about time we started to look into, were there really any Palestinians there in the first place? Or have they been invented?
Is that
not going to
something?
help the cause.
Is that something that you pick up in your reading of the Israeli press?
I haven't come up with something like that. I mean, there are talks that there's a whole. It's not a theory, right? But Palestine was a British mandate. So what people colloquially use as Palestinian people today, it wasn't a state before Israel was created. So in that sense, they were local Arab population, right? So I don't know if that's what they were referring to, but in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel, everyone refers to it as Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, whether you want to go and say that it was the Arab League and who created the discourse the way we know it today, that's I tend to agree with you. That discussion is already a long. It doesn't matter because this is what we are discussing today, and in any future constellation, the discussion will be what kind of agreement between Israel and the Palestinian people will exist. So.
Take one quick final question here before I'll hand over to Brett to Victoria.
Oh, Richard, thanks so much for your talk. Just talking about the accords with the neighbouring Arab countries, has that led to a change in the discourse which is allowed inside those countries, whether it be the Emirates or anywhere else, in terms of the level of what would be passed as anti-Semitism? Is it now being suppressed somewhat to encourage attitudes more favourable to Israel?
It's getting there. It's at first. The first year was what you would call a honeymoon, and in the best of ways, right? There was overwhelming excitement, definitely on the Israeli side. I think within the first couple of months, half of Israel flew to Dubai, just Dafka, because we get to fly to United Arab Emirates. It's unimaginable. And, all the Israelis were told that the shopping is awesome. So, so you get these two things together. No, but on a serious note, it was an overwhelming excitement. I think Israelis are taught peace and the prospect of an actual peace, not like the one we have with Egypt, where we don't get to travel there really, and there's no people-to-people initiatives and interactions. Here, Israelis saw an opportunity for a different type of peace with Arab countries, and the reaction on the other side was parallel to that, but not on a I want to choose my words carefully. We have a slightly more developed civil society than they do. A lot of the discourse in the countries of the Abraham discourse is managed by decision makers and by the elites. And the reaction coming from there is overwhelming. They're open. There is talk about Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism. They are very excited at the prospect of developing relations to Israel. We haven't seen a parallel tourist influx from their states into Israel. COVID also contributed to that, because only a few months ago did Israel open its borders actually to tourists. And also the Israelis are so, we love to travel, we love to fly. So the minute they open the Ben Gurion airport, whoop, half of the country goes somewhere. And the fact that now we don't have to fly for 4 or 5 hours to European destinations, rather 3 hours to Dubai, makes it even more appealing. But yes, I would hope that this would be followed by more tourism from their countries. There are projects are being discussed about ongoing people-to-people initiatives. That's where everyone wants to influence, to go, because it's clear that on a policy level and a leadership level, we're there already, right? And now it's a question of how we translate the excitement on the Israeli side, grassroots, to something similar or parallel on their end. When we talk to people from the Abraham Accord countries, most of them will say that inside of their countries, there's very little anti-Semitism. The Bahraini, there's a Jewish woman, a member of the parliament in Bahrain, and she's very outspoken. She has interviewed a lot in Israel, spoke at conferences and so on. There are hundreds of initiatives. So I think we will be seeing more and more of this. And going back to your question about image, there's nothing that works better than people-to-people initiatives. Then coming to Israel, meeting the Israeli people, getting to know the culture, breaking those taboos, because they have been fed things in their media, in their education system, in their mosques maybe, across the board for years, for decades. And that is not easy to break. But the more they get to know us, and the more that the leadership continues to send a clear message that the partnership is strategic and that we face the same challenges, I think we will be seeing more and more of that. But on the Israeli side, the excitement it's absolute terms. Left, right, center.
I was in Dubai a week and a half ago, and we were guests. To Henry's question, one thing that we can and we do, we sent 6 Australian journalists to Israel through Dubai. And due to the Abraham Accords, we in the Jewish community in Australia have been able to build very strong relationships, specifically with the Emirati Embassy in Canberra and the Moroccan Embassy in Canberra too. As official guests of the UAE government, we were VIPs to the World Expo, which is closing up in Dubai in 2 days. And we were there in the Israeli pavilion watching Iranians come and take photos under Israeli flags, facilitated by the Emiratis. Iranians. So people you can get an Expo passport, and you get your passport stamped at all the pavilions that you can go to. And there were a huge amount of Iranians willingly going to the Israeli pavilion, taking photos under now you would expect that there would be security everywhere. There was no security. We were in there, we went inside the pavilion, we had an Israeli host, and we were there with a group of Emiratis. And it was so warm, and it was so powerful, and it was so incredible that on Arab soil, in a country that didn't recognize Israel, its existence, let alone its legitimacy, was facilitating the meeting of Iranians and Israeli Jews together in the one place. I kid you not, it was a phenomenal experience to witness with my own eyes, but the speed in which it's happened after the Abraham Accords is astonishing. And astonishing in a good way.
And another to that, we have seen improvement for all of us in the pro-Israel community of what we do in Europe and in North America, meaning the European elected officials, members of the parliament, are extremely interested in what Israel is doing with the Abraham Accord countries. So all of a sudden, we get members of the European Parliament with someone from the Abraham Accord countries and the Israeli elected officials, and they want to do things together. And if we say, let's do them on NGO issues, they're all, interested in doing it. It has brought new hope, but not in a naive way, rather in a geopolitical way, as a change of regional paradigm entirely, and how everyone views what we are used to calling a Middle East conflict. No one talks about a Middle East conflict today. I mean, I stopped calling it a Middle East conflict years ago. I insist that it's an Israeli-Palestinian territorial dispute. But today, no one talks about Middle East conflict because there is none. There is Israeli-Palestinian issue, and then there is Abraham Accords, where we are actually talking about jointly addressing a common threat, which is Iran and its proxies. But it's mind-blowing if you think about it.
Etihad Airlines given some serious money to the Zionist Federation. Why are they sponsors? They've actually given money.
Right. And just to add something that Joel said, I flew to Dubai on my way here. From Tel Aviv, you flew from Australia, I'm guessing, right?
So we flew on both ways.
Okay, so my flight last Thursday to Dubai was the flight to Expo, basically, because I was the only one, or maybe 2 or 3 more people continuing to Australia. All the rest of the people on a packed flight were Israeli businessmen flying to the Expo.
Yeah.
So maybe the pieces through people's
That's been going on
pockets
for quite a long time.
Yeah, but
wallets.
just so you know, so we had dinner with the Australian mission. The Australians, because everyone loves Australia, right? So the Australians were facilitating meetings with the Israelis and other Arab countries that they don't have normalization agreements to sign secret trade deals amongst each other. So hundreds of millions of dollars in trade deals and other deals were signed on the down low in Expo, not only facilitated bilaterally, but also multilaterally with Australia assisting. And the Australians were telling us how amazing it was for them to facilitate meetings with Israel and other countries with their pavilions. Look, the whole of Expo was a remarkable illustration of what you can do when you teach your society and promote within your society harmony. Because it really was an example and illustration of that. And all kudos, in my opinion, goes to the Emiratis for being able to facilitate that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not either an expat living in the Emirates, nor am I an Emirati, so can't really speak about how it is to live in those areas. But kudos to them for what they were able to facilitate with Expo.
Was there a lot of conversation then about the Biden administration and their about-turn policy when it comes to, in a way, turning against those countries who have actually...
Yeah, it's funny because on the way to Expo, so the Expo is built in the middle of the desert, and on the way you've got the metropolis of Dubai and you've got oil installations along the way. It's about a 20-minute drive. And about 48 hours earlier, Iran-backed Houthis had used attack drones to strike an oil refinery inside metropolitan area in Abu Dhabi, so we were another 45 minutes down the road. So I was able to tell the journalists that were there, you see this oil installation 48 hours ago, Iran essentially, through their proxies in Yemen, was able to strike this, and this is why, you know, the situation with the Biden administration is so precarious, not just in, not in Israel, but in these Arab countries as well. So that was discussed extensively, because they are very frightened about, well, they're very concerned about the threat that's posed by the Houthis, and to have the US administration delist them as a terror organisation, I think was seen as a big slap in the face to a lot of people in the Arab Peninsula.
Why has O'Malley got such power on that note then?
Let's just say he's one of many characters who are legacy characters of the Obama administration that have maintained their jobs or regained their jobs in the Biden administration. Look, that's a very long conversation. I would like to call on Dr. Brent Carlisle from the Zionist Federation to give a vote.
Thank you, everyone, very much.
Since before the establishment of the State of Israel, there have been efforts to stop and to reverse Jewish self-determination. These efforts have been diplomatic, political, economic, violent. Most of these efforts have targeted the State of Israel, and in the face of them, Israel has survived. Israel has thrived. However, in recent decades, as Olga has been talking about, parts of civil society have been less focused on targeting Israel and more focused on targeting civil society elsewhere and, through it, the general public. They are trying to make the State of Israel illegitimate, beyond the pale for the general public. Where they are successful, calls for sanctions against Israel are seen as justified. Violence against Israel is seen as justified, if regrettable. Where they are successful, every single Israeli action, including efforts to defend itself, is seen as illegitimate. But, as Olga discussed, this campaign against Israel doesn't just harm Israel, it harms Jews everywhere. Because a central component of modern Jewish identity, especially here in Australia, is the State of Israel. So when these haters try to undermine the legitimacy of Jewish self-determination, they are saying to the Jewish community that your identity is invalid, that you are morally suspect, because no matter how nuanced your connection to Israel is beyond the pale. Increasingly, again, as Olga mentioned, we are seeing young Jews in Australia and around the world being asked to leave their Zionist identity at the door as the price of admission to all sorts of clubs and interest groups. Jews are sometimes being excluded or singled out because they are sympathetic to Israel. Imagine the pressure this places on the youth. But we're also increasingly seeing young Jews around the world fight back. They are being ever louder and ever prouder of their Jewish identity, of their Zionist identity. They are refusing to have others define their identity for them. Now, the NGO Monitor is a key partner in this battle because it reveals the hollowness of so many of the haters' arguments. NGO Monitor does not merely defend Israel, it helps strengthen Jewish identity everywhere by providing the knowledge and facts with which Jews can push back against the haters, even if that is merely pushing back against the doubts that the haters might raise in the minds of Jewish youth. And so on behalf of the ZFA, of AIJAC, of the UIA, and indeed all of us tonight and the entire Jewish community, I want to thank you, Olga, for your work and for the work of NGO Monitor. Would everyone please join me?